Looking at Chapter 16 tonight, the South and the Slavery Controversy. Okay, as always, a couple of key points to go with this chapter. First of all, you got to realize that slavery is obviously one of the earliest stands in American history, but getting rid of slavery is an incredibly complicated thing to do. A lot of people were advocating for gradual emancipation, compensating Southerners for what they saw as their property and what they had a tremendous amount of capital tied up into. Others will start to say that this is ridiculous and that there should be an immediate end to slavery. And so, in all of that, you got to think about where the average American actually stood on the issue, and we'll come to look at that down the road. But the extension into territories is what sort of illuminates this issue, or heightens this issue, or escalates the divide over this issue. So I did want to just show this table to give us some numbers to kind of fall back on and start with, actually. And you can see that across the board, slavery increases everywhere, while it increases more in certain regions and certain states. From 1820 to 1860, the number of slaves in the South increases. Okay, King Cotton, right? It's Eli Whitney's cotton gin that really revives the institution of slavery, makes it very profitable again for Southerners. And, of course, they will be employing slaves in the field, sort of growing and harvesting cotton. But the North also will be profiting from the institution of slavery, as that raw cotton will be shipped north. So keep in mind that all sections of the country are being touched by the institution. Also involved with this would be Great Britain. And the South really thought that they had an upper hand over the North, and that if there ever was a war or a conflict between the North and the South, that Britain would side with them. Britain's largest industry was the cotton cloth industry, and it employed 1/5 of their workers, and 75% of the fiber that they were manufacturing came from the American South. Now, in terms of cotton production, we're dealing with soil depletion, soil butchery, maybe not to the extent of tobacco, I'm not really sure, but the same concept. And so a lot of the small-time planters can't continue to buy more land, or there's just no land available to them. And as a result, they tend to sell out to larger planters. And so there's a consolidation of lands as small-time planters are selling out and moving north, moving west, and looking for other opportunities and so forth. And you have kind of the emergence of monopolies. Now, something you should also keep in mind is that in growing one single cash crop, you're not diversifying, and the value of your assets is really tied to the world market. So the whole system of cotton production in the South is discouraging healthy diversification of agriculture, and it's also impeding manufacturing because the value in the land is in producing the actual raw crop, and the labor is held in bonds. So in that regard, the South has no need to change their ways. In fact, those who are in positions of power and wealth are profiting quite heavily from the way things were. And so this elite group comes to be sort of the planter aristocracy in the South. And, just that alone is kind of an insult, attacking the Southern planter class as being sort of above the rest, if you want to think of it that way. And they're a group that has built their wealth and established their position on the backs of slaves. And they seem to have no problem with the ownership of another human being. At least they don't have enough of a problem to change the system and effectively greatly reduce their own economic standing. This diagram shows the main house sort of in the top left quadrant of this diagram, where the wealthy planters would have lived, their domain, and you can see that they are very distinctly separated from the slave quarters and where the slaves would have worked. So again, sort of showing this elitist, aristocratic kind of group that is not directly in contact with this horrible institution that is in fact, giving them their position. They perhaps may have been involved with some of the old traditions of Europe, as a fox hunt you might see here. And so the average white Southerner did not own slaves at all, and the elite planter class that I've referenced before was in fact a very small percentage of society. Most people who did own slaves owned 1 to 4 slaves, and while that may seem like a relatively small number to what we think was common practice, and in fact did establish a position within the social classes. And so, I just remember being a kid and seeing roots and learning about slavery and thinking that all situations where slaves were owned were on plantations with overseers who were using corporal punishment and so forth. And really, that's just one part of the bigger picture. And so large plantation owners probably didn't have a regular interaction with slaves, at least field hands, that is, of course, and they certainly did not labor alongside them as the small farmers did. And I do think the pageant explained pretty clearly that that proximity, sort of increased the bond between whites and slaves. Not to say that there was an equal relationship, but they suggest in the book that, in fact, there was a much more close relationship, and in fact, a familiarity that comes along with working alongside someone for quite some time. Non-slaveholding whites, however, who didn't have any interaction on a regular basis with slaves, still supported the institution. And the question is, well, why would they do that? Well, it's most likely because by keeping African Americans in bondage, they themselves were at a relatively higher standing. Just to kind of build on the point that I said before, you can see, and this is right directly from our book here, you can see these slave-owning families in 1850, that the majority of people who did own slaves owned somewhere between 2 to 4, and it's very unlikely that folks were owning more than 99 at least. However, as we also see in the book, where there was cotton, there was a large concentration of slavery, and I think it is worth reminding ourselves of the cotton gin and the changes that brought about in the industry of cotton growing, of textile manufacturing, and of course with the institution of slavery. What about free blacks in the South? In 1860, there were 250,000 total in the South. They could have been freed by their masters. They could have purchased their freedom from working on their day off on Sunday. They could have run away. But as the pageant says, they were considered somewhat of a third race. There were other restrictions placed on them, such as restricted employment. They could not testify against whites in court. And later on, at least after 1850, there was a great concern about being captured and, I suppose, just falsely charged with being a runaway slave, and therefore sold back into bondage or returned home to some master. There's also a large population of free blacks in the North, and they are not necessarily being welcomed. Many states denied them the right to vote. Some barred African Americans from public schools. Generally speaking, blacks faced prejudice in the North. So, don't mistake yourself and think that everybody above the Mason-Dixon line was open-minded and welcoming, because that's just not the case. Certainly Irish immigrants who, again, don't forget, were moving to cities. They were poor. They came here as a result of the potato famine. They're entering into competition with people on the bottom rung of society, which of course would be free blacks at this point, and so there's a lot of animosity and conflict between those two groups. And so there were 4 million enslaved African Americans in the South, which equated to roughly $2 billion in capital that Southerners had invested in their slaves. And the textbook tells us that in 1860 slaves were worth about $1,800, which, using the inflation calculator, came up with $49,000 in modern money. You might be able to see why Southerners who owned 100, 150 slaves might be concerned about compensation should the system be abolished. But you also have to realize that the importation of slaves was no longer legal after 1808, and so that increased the value of slaves here, and places that could, in fact, sell slaves began to do so. So Virginia, for example, would profit heavily from domestic slave trade. And in fact, they offered freedom as an incentive to female slaves to have 10, 12 children. And so again, I can't stress this enough that looking back on the institution of slavery, it blows my mind that it existed for as long as it did in the United States. But remember that it was the backbone of the Southern economy. It was very profitable for the planter class. And while it did slow economic growth as a whole, and of course was degrading in all ways to the slaves themselves, it was an important part of the overall American economy. And, sort of the question of how do we end this situation is probably question number 1. And as I said before, question 2 is, what does the average American in 1860, for example, actually think about slavery, and to what extent are they concerned about ending it? How important is it to them? And so, books like Uncle Tom's Cabin will begin to show the real truth of the institutions or the slave auctions and how families are separated and how people are beaten and how people are being exploited for their labor, and how they're exploited sexually and how they're just being degraded. And just the title of this section, Life Under the Lash, is a constant reminder that corporal punishment, in fact, was always a possibility. In fact, some employed breakers, specifically given the task of beating slaves that were strong-willed, that refused to accept their position, that did not show the overt and unconditioned, passive, submissive sort of position towards their owners. Let's remember that slaves did resist both covertly, as in working slow and breaking tools, and also in a more overt way in terms of running away, and ultimately with rebellion. So in 1800, a slave named Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, 1822, and of course Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia, all led slave uprisings. All of those failed, and all of those added to the sort of paranoia and fear of Southern whites in the South as well. 1839, enslaved Africans aboard a Spanish slave ship did rebel and took control of the ship, and they were brought to the United States. And John Quincy Adams argued on their behalf before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1841 and successfully got them returned to the British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. And here is Anthony Hopkins playing John Quincy Adams in the Amistad movie. And he's scarier in real life. And so, at various points in American history, there have been movements to return African Americans to Africa, and the American Colonization Society is an example of a group that did that, or tried to do that. Henry Clay, by the way, is a founding member of that group. In 1822, the Republic of Liberia was created with the capital city of Monrovia, and it was created as a place for Southern blacks to return to. However, most Africans in the USA did not want to go back to Africa because, in fact, they were Americans and they had a distinct African American culture that had, sort of evolved in the South from that experience and that built on African traditions, without doubt, but also was distinctly American. By the 1830s, abolition evolved into a moral crusade. Here's a map of Liberia, by the way, by the Côte d'Ivoire. Henry Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, as I said before, really showed a lot of people who had no communication, no connection at all with slavery, what the institution was actually like for those involved. Aside from that book, folks like William Lloyd Garrison in the North and his Boston newspaper, The Liberator, really embody this radical abolitionist sentiment. He is known for saying that in no circumstances would he tolerate the poisonous weed of slavery. In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded as well. I want to mention a few black abolitionists that were prominent in the United States. David Walker wrote his appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829. Sojourner Truth was a freed black woman who also advocated for women's rights in general. And Martin Delany supported a Back to Africa movement. The most famous and most influential black abolitionist, however, is going to be Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass looked to politics to end slavery, whereas folks like William Lloyd Garrison were increasingly kind of moving away from that. He wrote an autobiography called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and in that he describes his sort of journey being freed, and his experience being a literate biracial orator who is obviously seen by the majority as a threat to the system, and yet one who feels that he is on this crusade to, in fact, liberate his people and bring us all into the light of equality. I know the book tells us that he was routinely threatened and physically beaten, and yet did not give up on the cause, and in fact was a prominent leader in it. And so in the South, in the 1820s at least, anti-slavery societies were more common than in the North. That shifted in the 1830s, and a couple of things that were happening in the South probably added to that. The first of which was Nat Turner's rebellion. Any armed rebellion is going to raise concern, suspicion, and paranoia. In this case, all of blacks in the South in general. Also, the nullification crisis in 1832 probably raised concern and heightened tension, as the question is, can states now declare something unconstitutional if they feel that it is, and therefore nullify that law? That in fact be divisive and create more problems. Pro-slavery whites in the South defended the institution as a positive good, as I said before, and a key argument they make for that is to say that northern wage earners were not cared for at all, were not taken care of, had no protection, in fact, no guarantee of employment if they were to fall ill or get hurt or something like that. Whereas in the South, the argument was at least that slaves were taken care of, and so while that may be true, still it was being used to justify the ownership of human beings. Here's a dramatic scene of Nat Turner's rebellion. As you can see, it depicts this poor family being, attacked mercilessly by these slaves. And so the position of extreme abolition in the North was not popular. The North had its own prejudice to overcome, as I said before, and they also had a direct and distinct stake in the South. They are dependent upon Southern cotton. It's clear as day. By the 1850s, the North was starting to see the evils of slavery and came to see the South as the land of the unfree and the home of the hateful institution. And while folks like William Lloyd Garrison certainly began to propagate that message, also, as I said before, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a widely read book, was also doing the same thing. In 1836, the House of Representatives passed the Gag Resolution, which said that all such anti-slavery appeals would be tabled without debate, as in they would be set aside. Representative John Quincy Adams shows up again and fought this successfully. I believe it took 8 years to get that repealed. Abolitionist literature began to flood to the South as well, and in 1835, amidst the request of Southerners, the Washington government ordered that Southern postmasters would destroy the abolitionist material. So much for your free press. And there he is again. Just look out. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please email. I'll see you in class tomorrow.